So our snippets for this week are going to look at the battle over the League of Nations, end of World War I. U.S. ultimately will choose not to join the League of Nations amidst domestic disagreements, and then a bit on the aftermath of the war politically and in U.S. Latin American relations. So here's the New York Times headline: with the armistice officially ending World War I, the Kaiser forcibly removed due to U.S. pressure to the Netherlands, which was in retrospect a terrible mistake by Wilson, because it had the effect of ensuring that the new German democratic government, their first move would be suing for peace with the West, and it was not going to be a favorable peace. This is a war unlike any other war in world history before this time. Obviously, it's dwarfed by what happens in World War II, but the number of deaths in this conflict are quite extraordinary. So this is a chart. This is the Allies, which looks at the total dead, military and civilians. You have a lot of countries, Russia is a classic example here, where there are huge numbers of civilian deaths in the war as well. And among the Allies, proportionally the greatest effect is Serbia, where almost 1 in 5 of the pre-war population dies during the war. And unsurprisingly for the Central Powers, the German faction, their effect is even worse, because they're ultimately the losing parties. So in the Ottoman Empire, it's 2.1 million civilians who die. Part of this is the Armenian genocide, but huge numbers of military deaths as well. And this, of course, is all occurring amidst the spreading of the Spanish flu in 1918 and 1919. So you have this pandemic on top of these war-related deaths. Wilson, and I had mentioned this in the question and answer video from yesterday. Wilson seems to have leverage because the Allies were so dependent on U.S. Economic aid. After the war, Wilson loses a lot of that leverage, but he does go to Paris as the head of the U.S. peace delegation. You can see Vive Wilson up here. They hang it in Paris. He's swarmed. He's extremely popular. The problem that Wilson faces, however, is that both the British and the French governments are insistent on really harsh pieces against Germany. They've suffered enormous losses. 1.1 million military deaths in the case of the British, 1.4 million in the case of the French. The Italians are demanding an enforcement of the Treaty of London, which would have given to them access to the Adriatic coast in modern-day Slovenia and Croatia, but that would have violated Wilson's self-determination principles. Wilson tells the Italians no. The Italian prime minister storms out of the Paris Peace Conference, but he can't really force his way on Britain and France. And so the result is this is Wilson with the so-called Big Four: David Lloyd George, Vittorio Orlando, and George Clemenceau. So Lloyd George is in charge of Britain. Orlando in charge of Italy, Clemenceau the political leader of France, and then Wilson. And basically at the table, the agreement is the creation of a League of Nations, which is what Wilson wanted. But territorial concessions by the Germans, they lose their colonies, they lose a portion of territory, and critically, they are tasked by the Paris Peace Treaty to accept full and sole responsibility for World War I, which was absurd. I mean, all of these countries shared the responsibility, and as a result, they were required to pay what's called reparations to the Allies, equal to the cost of the war. That's going to be a big issue in the 1920s. So these four men really have very, very different agendas at the peace conference. Wilson is trying to implement his peace without victory approach. He does largely succeed in championing self-determination. There is a new Europe that is created by the Versailles Peace Treaty. All of these countries here in yellow, starting from Finland in the north, going down to Yugoslavia in the south, are newly created at the Paris Peace Conference. So the conference occurs in Paris. That's why I'm calling it the Paris Peace Conference. But the treaty itself is signed in Versailles, one of Louis XIV's palaces. So it's called the Treaty of Versailles. So you see how the boundaries are redrawn. The idea is to create a degree of ethnically homogeneous countries: Finland, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Poland, although there are substantial minorities within Poland: Ukrainians, Jews, a small number of Romanians, and critically for what's going to be coming later on, Germans. Germany itself is divided into two parts. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, formerly Serbia, Montenegro, the Serbian monarch basically annexes areas of Austria-Hungary. And on this map, you can kind of see where the old empires are. So these newly created states are carved out of the former Russia Empire. Remember, the communists have taken control over Russia. The former Austro-Hungarian Empire, which ceases to exist after World War I, and the former German Empire. Parts of France, Denmark, and Poland are ceded from Germany. The problem with the Wilsonian peace is that it's both too harsh, but not quite harsh enough. Germany remains a major power. But Wilson's hope is that by creating these states based on self-determination, based on nationalism in Eastern Europe, the result will be a more stable international order. Of the newly created states, I think the most interesting is probably Czechoslovakia, which is a country that we're going to be coming back to several times in this course. It combines portions of the former Austrian section of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Bohemia and Moravia, which are primarily Czech areas with a substantial German minority here in dark blue. Within the west, within the east, Slovakia, and Ruthenia. Slovakia, these are Slovaks. Ruthenians are a descendant of a group of Ukrainians. But then in the southern part of Slovakia, there are Hungarians. And in the very northern tip of Czechoslovakia, it's a primarily Polish area. So this is an ethnically polyglot state. There are also Roma and Jews who live in Czechoslovakia. So even though the principle here is self-determination based on nationalism, it just can't be drawn in this part of the world where you can get an ethnically homogeneous state. And almost all of these new states, Czechoslovakia is the exception, will eventually descend into some kind of right-wing authoritarian government. So Wilson's dream of creating a democratic Europe doesn't really play out. Now, Wilson understands that there is going to be, there are going to continue to be disputes. It's going to be a tough situation, but the expectation is that these can all be handled by the newly created League of Nations. This is really the core principle behind Wilson's contribution to the Treaty of Versailles. And the critical element of the League of Nations is Article 10, the collective security provision, which basically says all members of the League, respect territorial integrity, and that if one member of the League is attacked, all of the members will come together. This is, think of what would have happened at the start of World War I when Germany invades Belgium. If the Germans knew that if they did invade Belgium, that every other country in the world would militarily come against them. This is a good idea in theory. I mean, I think we all understand how difficult it is to implement collective security in practice, but this isn't the sense at the time. And then there's another article of the League of Nations Covenant, Article 11, which says that if there are disputes which might lead to war, not necessarily invasion, that any member of the League of Nations has the authority to bring the matter to the attention of the Assembly or the Council. And again, this is a World War I related lesson learned. The idea is that if there had been an international organization around in July of 1914, a country like the United States or Japan or Bulgaria could have brought the tensions between Austria and Russia, Austria and Serbia, to the attention of an international organization. Maybe they could have found a way out of it. Wilson sees both of these articles, Article 10 and Article 11, as peace-oriented approaches, ways to avoid war. His critics, though, as we'll see in the U.S., view both of them as actually contributing to war. And this is one of the difficulties that Wilson has. Now, in East Asia, the big winner from World War I is Japan. The Japanese acquire most of the former German possessions in China. They're the dominant power within Northeast Asia. The former German possessions in the southwestern Pacific generally go to the U.S. or to the British as League of Nations trustees. So that is that they're not really colonies; they're just administered by other countries. And in the Middle East, Wilson's admiration for self-determination isn't enough to overcome another one of these secret treaties from the war. Remember, Treaty of London, which got Italy into the war. This map is a map of another secret treaty called the Sykes-Picot Accords, which was between the British and the French, in which they agreed to divide up the former Ottoman Empire. So you can keep this in the back of your mind. The British and the French are committed to war aims that will lead to the destruction of two of the countries that are fighting against them, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. The British want this southern area because this is the beginning of the oil boom, and they sense that there's going to be oil here. The French want the Levant. The French have had longstanding commercial interest in Lebanon. You can kind of see the map of the modern Middle East coming here. Here's sort of Lebanon, and here's basically Syria. Here's the beginnings of Iraq. Here's Jordan. And then there's, according to Sykes-Picot, there's going to be a condominium in part of modern day Israel. The condominium is expanded into a League of Nations mandate under British control called the Palestinian Mandate, to implement a document called the Balfour Declaration, in which the British commit themselves to support a Jewish homeland in the former territory of the kingdom, the ancient kingdom of Israel. So both in East Asia and in the Middle East, the maps are substantially redrawn as a result of World War I. But Wilson, again, this is the League of Nations headquarters in Geneva. Wilson's convinced that the League will be able to resolve any remaining tensions as a result of the war. So that's pretty much it for our first snippet.